On July 11th, 1908, in the quiet upstate town of Sand Lake, New York, the body of a young woman was discovered in Teal's Pond, off of what was then known as Teal's Road. The body was identified as that of Hazel Irene Drew, a 20-year-old working-class woman whose sensationalized murder would not only go on to memorize the entire United States, but also serve as an outline for one of the most popular murder plot stories on TV of all time. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the back of the head. On July 31st, after weeks of investigation and testimony from witnesses, this statement was released to the public. This plainly worded coroner's report, out of context, does not convey the extent to which the investigation of Hazel Drew's murder stretched. It also did not communicate other vital circumstances surrounding the case: Hazel's popularity within her hometown before her death, the friends and family members who refused to cooperate with the investigation, detectives who interviewed hundreds of people, and the media circus and subsequent pressure surrounding the case, which ultimately made it even more difficult to solve. This unsolved case actually stuck out to Mark Frost, who spent his summers in Taborton, New York, and was intrigued by this case. Much like Laura Palmer in the hit TV series Twin Peaks, Hazel was very well liked by her community, and though she didn't really seem to be on speaking terms with much of her family, she never held any known bad blood with them. So when her body was discovered in Teal's Pond with her hat and gloves placed neatly on the road 20 feet away, everyone was baffled. I actually grew up in Averill Park, which is about a 5-minute drive from Teal's Pond, but I didn't find out that this case was, from my hometown, and I've been obsessed with it ever since. Though there's still been no clear answer to this cold case, I thought it would be worth going through a little bit. It seems to me not only a baffling cold case, but a great example of how the sensationalization of media, even at a relatively early point in history, can lead to an initially perplexing case becoming even more hard to solve. Sand Lake is a small town in the Rensselaer County of upstate New York. In the early 1900s, it was made up of several small hamlets, or small settlements, and back then the town population was about 2,000. Though today's Sand Lake is a kind of quiet suburb of about 8,500 people, back then it had this huge coal, farming, and mill industry. And in the summer, the main source of income was actually tourism. By train 20 minutes from Albany and Troy, and about 3 hours from New York City, the area and its quiet lakes and fine dining options made the place really popular within the wealthy elite. 1 mile from Averill Park, one of these hamlets, and where I grew up, stood the notorious Crepes Hotel, a popular getaway which included a tavern, restaurant, and barbershop, which is today a few buildings which still house a restaurant/tavern and salon. If a person were traveling from Crepes Hotel, he might take a right onto a country lane, today known as Teal Road, ascend the small Taborton Mountain for about a quarter of a mile, and happen across a small pond. This pond belonged to Conrad Teal, a local farmer and mill operator who lived on the road, and who, before a bait tax would come to pass, would allow locals to catch live bait. To operate his mill, Conrad used a small creek and built a dam which created the 10 feet deep pond, situated about 25 yards down a steep bank off of Taborton Road. Hazel Irene Drew was the eldest daughter of John and Julia Drew, and the second of their 5 children. Born, raised, and educated in Postonkill, she left at the age of 14 to pursue work opportunities in the city of Troy. She found work as a domestic servant for various elite members of the city, such as John Tupper, a candidate for mayor in 1897. Though Hazel seemed to not be very close with anyone in her immediate family, through these endeavors she found a lot of friends, and was adored by a lot of these employers. John Tupper's wife at the time of Hazel's employment actually gave her a United Kingdom Society pin, with her initials HID. A blonde, attractive, and charming young woman, Hazel was said to have preferred a night in rather than going out. She attended church regularly and always followed the rules, and tended to prefer a quiet night in the library. After an illness, we'll get to that, during the winter of 1907 to 1908, terminated her employment with the Tuppers, and she secured a job working for the Carey family in Troy. She started working for the family in February and then worked there for 5 months, and Mary Carey, who was the wife of Drew Carey, an engineering professor at RPI, stated that she had never seen any man call on Hazel, she didn't have a steady boyfriend, but that she made friends easily and the girl was a delight to be around. On the morning of July 6, 1908, Hazel unexpectedly quit her job at the Careys. Both of them said they had no idea what brought on this sudden change in manner, as up until that point she had pretty much gotten along with them really well, and there didn't seem to be a problem that warranted her quitting. However, Hazel packed her suitcase, said goodbye to Mary, and left. Lorenzo Gruber, George White, and Frank and Ed Sawalski, local teenagers who worked in town, were spending the weekend as they usually do, camping in the woods near Conrad's property on Saturday, July 11th, 1908. That morning, the Sawalskis were taking a cow path back to town for their daily work, with White leaving after them to see another friend for a breakfast near the area. Around 9:30, Gruber was getting ready to head out when he hurriedly rushed by the pond, stopping in his tracks when something floating in the water caught his eye. White was about to head up the hill when he heard his friend shout, "Come back! There's a woman's body in the pond!" The teenagers were shaken and didn't really know what to do. They were even more so when Miller found a black straw hat and a pair of gloves along the road, placed neatly about 20 feet from the path. Miller went to get the authorities while the other boys tried unsuccessfully to bolt the body out of the water. Shortly after, people started arriving on the scene. There was George Alberts, who was at the Crepes Hotel and had heard about the incident from the teenagers. Frank Smith, who was a local teenager known in the population as kind of a half-wit. And the first person of authority, Dr. Boyce. After the initial shock of the event, it was clear that the woman's body had been in the water for a few days, if not more. It was also clear that she hadn't died by drowning. After the scene had been cleaned up and the body went to the morgue for inspection, Joyce went to the Justice of the Peace in Averil Park and told him that he suspected foul play. An investigation was conducted and District Attorney Jarvis O'Brien was brought to the scene. On Monday, July 13th, a man named John Drew was called in to identify the clothing on the woman's body. After arriving with his wife, Julia, and their daughter-in-law, Eva, he confirmed that it was indeed his daughter, Hazel, through various identifiers such as golden tooth fillings and the very pin that the Tuppers had gifted her. O'Brien and his co-workers spent the next few weeks interviewing hundreds of people about Hazel's death and her whereabouts up until then. From what the investigation could gather, after she had left the Carey residence on July 6th wearing a newly sewn outfit with a suitcase full of items that were enough for a one-night stay but no more, Hazel had lied to her Aunt Minnie Taylor about her destination that day. Minnie was an exception to Hazel's indifference toward her immediate family and one of her close companions. Hazel lied to Minnie about her destination and actually ended up going to Union Station, taking the train from Sand Lake to Albany, but then returning a short while afterward. After putting in an order for a separate trunk than the one she had with her to be delivered to her parents' house in Troy, but never going there, Hazel spent that night somewhere unknown with the suitcase that she had with her, and nobody who was questioned during the investigation said she had stayed with them that night. On July 7th, she was seen again at Union Station wearing the same outfit as the day before, and looking as though she was waiting for somebody to arrive. Then she checked her suitcase out at 2 p.m. and left. Her whereabouts after this are completely unknown until after her body was discovered in Teal's Pond on July 11th. A few weeks into the investigation on Monday, July 20th, what was at first thought to be a startling break in the case was revealed, when it was discovered that Hazel had actually stored a trunk in her parents' attic, marked to be incinerated. When the trunk was opened, dozens of personal handwritten letters and postcards that Hazel had sent to other people and ones that other people had sent to her were found. These cards are pretty platonic, but a lot of the handwriting was identified and those people were subsequently questioned. However, no leads were ever found on this discovery, though a lot more of Hazel's seemingly private life was revealed, with continuing pressure from both the local news media and the family, as well as the now national news media. Jarvis O'Brien decided to call a coroner's inquest, which would basically allow him to question anyone that he wanted. The inquest began on July 27th at Warger's Hotel in Averil Park. The 4 teenagers who had discovered Hazel's body retold their accounts, and Mr. and Mrs. Henry Rollman, a local couple, testified that they had seen a blonde woman walking down Taborton Road the very night Hazel disappeared, on the evening of July 7th around 7:30 p.m. Rudy Gunger and Frank Smith were called, 2 initial suspects who had claimed to see and talk to Hazel on the very same night, but the most anticipated witness by far was Hazel's own uncle, William Taylor, who owned a farm further up Taborton Road and who had been pretty indifferent to the news of his niece's death, despite the fact that she had spent the summer of 1907 at his house. However, since these detectives had no hard evidence against Taylor, other than his suspicious disposition and unwillingness to help the case, he was never charged. On Tuesday, the doctors who performed Hazel's autopsy testified, saying that the official cause of her death was blunt force trauma to the back of her head with a blunt object. Then she was carried to the pond and laid to rest. The next phase of the inquest was held on Thursday and saw testimony from Hazel's friends and family. 22 separate people were actually subpoenaed, including Drew Carey and Minnie Taylor, who both retold their recollections. One of the more notable people there was Henry Krameth, a notable Albany elite businessman and real estate guy who actually owned a camping camp in the nearby Alps, and who was confirmed to have some sort of relationship with Hazel. During the investigation, one of the neighbors had testified that they had actually heard a woman screaming coming from the camp on the night of Hazel's unknown whereabouts. Krameth vehemently denied this accusation. Another witness of note was Chris Crape, who owned the Crapes Hotel, who said that he had seen a car coming from Avon Park going to Taborton Road that very evening and coming back a few minutes later. However, Crape's story drew suspicion, as earlier he said he had saw this on the night of July 4th, though at the inquest changed it to July 6th. On Friday, July 31st, 1908, the final statement on Hazel Drew's death was released. The following weeks, the newspapers finally died down as all of the drama from Sand Lake went away, and the town settled in for a different but quiet winter. Despite the killer never being caught, tourists would still attend the area every summer, and the unsolved murder of Hazel Irene Drew would be more or less forgotten. There were only ever a few likely suspects in Hazel's murder case, although hundreds of people were looked into and subsequently exhausted. After extensive research of this topic, I've decided to only pull the suspect who kind of fits the psychological profile of Hazel Drew's killer, who is a man known only by the initials of CES. Hazel's frequent and unexplained trips to various cities before her death can be explained through her correspondence with CES, who was a man she had been in quasi-romantic contact with up until June 13th of 1908. Minnie Taylor confirmed her relationship with him, though she would not reveal his identity for the reason of protecting Hazel's friends. His postcards to Hazel revealed an adoration of the girl, yet at the same time implied this sort of abusive distrust towards her. And these cards all came from Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, the same cities Hazel had been visiting more frequently in the weeks leading up to her death. During the week of July 4, it was discovered that Hazel had actually been planning a secret trip to Lake George with an unknown person, but had ultimately spent the weekend with her aunt watching the parade in Troy. The last postcard CES sent to Hazel indicated that he would like to have a rendezvous with her in Albany sometime in June of 1908. If CES had taken the train from Lake George, where it had seemed that Hazel had abandoned their weekend getaway, he would have to pass through Union Station if he wanted to meet her, and he might be angry for the weekend's ruined plans. Perhaps on that fateful night, the two met in the tavern in Albany, and Hazel apologized for not communicating her plans to him. If it were true that they were romantically involved, perhaps the idea of Hazel leaving Sand Lake and moving somewhere else with CES had come up more than once, and Hazel might have been under the impression that this was what was going to happen. He'd take her out to the country under the guise of letting her say a final goodbye to her younger brother Willie, who was also living on Taborton Road and who she had adored most of out of her family. Not wanting to drive his car up the really steep mountain road, he would suggest that the two of them take a walk for a while, and perhaps duck out of the way into the woods when people that Hazel knew but he didn't know, such as Frank and Rudy and the Rollmans, would appear. If their relationship was so secret in the first place, this might make sense to Hazel. And perhaps, at some point, when the road was dark and secluded, he asked Hazel to step in front of him, maybe to look at something in the trees. He took a rock in his hand and ended her life, dragging her body to the pond and fleeing back to one of his city homes, escaping suspicion altogether. To him, this really important real estate guy, Hazel was just another girl from the country who had angered him, and who he might have felt he needed to silence. Hazel's actions leading up to her death were no doubt unusual. However, I think there are actually several other issues which led to the unsolvability of this case. Hazel's case had captured the attention of not only the upstate New York media, but the national news media. Thousands of news articles were printed pretty much every week with updates on her death and case. Some of it was, harmless information, but some of it was like part of this growing negative opinion of the investigation itself. When there were lulls in the case and nobody had anything really interesting to report from the murdered girl from Sand Lake, they'd turn to kind of rumors and criticizing the doctors and investigation. Evening World, which was a New York City newspaper, asked why it took so long for O'Brien and his team to locate the suitcase, as well as Hazel's postcards and etc., and implied that all this early critical information was mishandled. The paper would also chide the four doctors who could not agree to whether Hazel was pregnant or not, which would have implied that her odd actions were the result of or in anticipation of an abortion. However, the general consensus at the end of the day was that she was a good girl, or put plainly, she hadn't lost her virginity yet, being an unmarried woman. However, the body was never actually exhumed, and the media was further suspicious of this. One of the main perpetrators of critique was William M Clemens, the world's leading self-titled criminologist. He was actually just a journalist for the Evening World, and was not the most reliable of news relayers. A journalist and editor with absolutely zero experience in criminal justice or law enforcement. Clemens actually claimed to have solved several cases which officially remain unknown to authorities today. As a former correspondent in 1884 covering presidential campaigns, he certainly knew how to embellish. He claimed to have solved the case of Mary Rogers in 1884, which actually served as the basis for the Edgar Allan Poe mystery, The Mystery of Mary Roget. And on July 17, 1908, he arrived in Troy to solve Hazel Drew's murder. His publishings were met with constant controversy and weren't even really reliable to a general population back then. Looking at the prints in hindsight, it's pretty clear that Clemens had this style of writing wherein he would reveal information he claimed to have personally discovered, yet would not share with others how he had done so. His covering of the Hazel Drew case was pages long and filled with contradictions, such as his personal discovery of Hazel's bracelets, when they had already been discovered and accounted for weeks. He then attacked the doctors for being incompetent, for he alone figured out that Hazel must have been pregnant when she died. He proved this fact by also mentioning that he knew that Lena Whitmore, a woman whose body was found in the Passaic River in 1907, was also pregnant 15 years before her death, a fact that none of the cops in that case were able to figure out, and something he could not have possibly known. This claim in relation to Whitmore was first published in July 24th, 1908, only in relation to Hazel's case, and was never actually mentioned anymore in the Whitmore case. Basically, his writings were laughably false and easily disprovable, but they were also incredibly enticing, and as a result, his actions would end up discrediting the investigators who were working on Hazel's murder case. And ultimately, neither Clemens nor any other criminologist could get any closer to the identity of the killer. Hazel and her family weren't of the wealthiest status in Averill Park, but they weren't poor either. She was known in her community as a pleasant, upper middle class girl. She came from a good family, several of her friends were trusted locals, and she didn't really seem close with the majority of them, but overall she was really well liked. As the eldest daughter of the Drew family, she was technically of the age for marriage, and though her family and employers don't really recall her having any steady boyfriend, it's clear from Hazel's personal and anecdotal correspondence from her friends that she was actually pretty much one of the more sought-after women in Troy. It didn't really seem like she wanted to be chained down to one person, and in her postcards it was actually revealed that she was in contact with a lot of different men, like Henry Krameth and Edmund Knopf, who was a dentist Hazel had gotten her gold fillings from. Some found it really odd that during the initial questioning, John Drew didn't really seem upset at the sight of his dead daughter, and neither did Julia. In fact, right after the courthouse on Monday, July 13th, John and Julia went to the bank to withdraw a $500 insurance life policy that they had taken out on Hazel. Strangely, Hazel's aunt, Minnie Taylor, also ordered all of her friends to destroy any correspondence they had had with Hazel, and purposefully hid the names from investigators as to protect their reputations. It seems as if even those who were very close to Hazel were more concerned with what her murder had done to taint the name than what had actually happened. I mean, unfortunately, this was not uncommon at the time, as a woman's disappearance was kind of seen as more of an embarrassment than anything else. Dorothy Arnold, a socialite who disappeared in New York City in 1910, was not reported missing by her parents until weeks after she was last seen, out of a fear of unwanted media attention. An unfortunate circumstance that definitely affected Hazel's case was the fact that she was a woman in the early 1900s. Initially, even though she was discovered in a pond with the blow to the back of her head, the investigation actually didn't throw out the possibility of right away, as that was just the common assumption of what happened when a woman was found dead. And though the scene painted pretty much an almost too clear picture of homicide, the effort put into proving a theory that Hazel was pregnant and therefore either planning a secret abortion or to end her own life detracted even more effort from the investigation. More than that, the heavy focus and analysis on Hazel's reproductive system and its slightly damaged state, though it did initially help in assessing whether or not there was a sexual aspect to the crime, minimized the extent of the investigation into other damning evidence. Refusal to exhume the body after the doctors had examined it raised even more suspicion, as exhumation could seriously aid in the field of hard evidence such as the confirmed cause of death and DNA analysis. Another detail that was seemingly overlooked time and time again by the male investigation team was the fact that everybody close to Hazel would state that she was a little bit closer to her female friends than her male friends and female members of her family. This was backed up by people like Carrie Weaver and Eva Taylor, both of whom were women who Hazel had spent a significant amount of time with before her death, and who had told the investigators things that Hazel had confided in them, pretty much secrets she wouldn't have told anyone else. Carrie said that Hazel had begun to travel more and more that past year, and that she thought that perhaps Hazel was planning to leave her hometown for good, as it seemed that she had cut off ties with everyone she knew, or was planning to due to the trunk in the attic, which was postmarked for incineration. This, along with the fact that Hazel kind of hid her love life from a lot of people that she knew, seems to indicate that Hazel may have come to realize she preferred women over men. A theory that was, with the general homophobia of the time, obviously never looked into. The combination of initially baffling evidence, a media circus which latched on to every detail around the case, fabricated or not, and the general air of sexism that women's murder cases were treated with at this time, resulted in this really suspicious and really unsolved homicide case. After interviewing hundreds of people, but with no leads following through, by the end of the inquest, O'Brien and his team had only a handful of suspects who never ended up being charged with anything, as there was no hard evidence ever found. It's quite harrowing to think that 100 years ago in my hometown, a girl close to my age and similar to me in more than one way, was effortlessly murdered and tossed into a pond not 2 miles from my childhood home. Today, the Hazel Drew story is known as local folklore, and it's said that her ghostly presence can be felt around town in more areas than one. Unfortunately, as is the case with most unsolved murders of women from the early 1900s, clues in Hazel's case, which may have revealed more of the truth, have been kept hidden or simply lost to time. Hey, thanks so much for watching this video. I really wanted to cover this since I grew up hearing the Hazel Drew ghost story. I didn't really know it was a real thing. I thought it was just like local lore. And I was actually able to get some real footage of the area, so I hope you enjoyed that. If you like this video, please leave a comment down below. Let me know what your own theory on the case is. I'm not gonna, become a true crime channel or anything. It's just like, this case kind of interested me in a way others really haven't. Again, thanks for watching if you've watched this far. I'm Abby, this is 1 minute off, and I'm gonna go get another coffee, even though it means I'm probably gonna crash at 4 p.m. this afternoon. Bye.